So I'm Josh, I work at Thoughtbot, and today I'm going to be talking about our experience shipping the first ever Elm mobile app. So just a quick show of hands, how many people here have ever worked on mobile apps? Okay, so maybe a little less than half. So the app under question is called Purple Train. And it's a simple interface for getting the commuter rail schedule in our hometown of Boston. And so it looks like this. It's very simple. It's got a couple tabs, and it's opinionated, basically made for people who are coming into Boston in the morning and going home at night. So the top two sections there are the next trains, and they show a little bit more detail. And then we have the next few trains below. Then at the bottom here, there's a button. It shows the selected stop. And then you can click it and choose a different one. And then there's alerts. So if your train is going to be delayed or canceled, we'll let you know. So it's simple, but it's not too simple. And we thought this was a good test bed for an experiment. But the app was originally written in React Native. And the first version was released in November. And just a show of hands again, how many people have worked with React Native? Okay, decent amount. So Thoughtbot's been using React Native for a year or so, and we really love it. And in fact, we think it's a good default for most mobile apps, specifically CRUD-based apps. Games, you might want something more performant and work closer to the metal. But we really like it for quite a few reasons. The first of which, and I think the most important, is that it's cross-platform. And it's cross-platform without giving up native UI, right? So there's other technologies out there like PhoneGap and Titanium, but those don't use native UI. And the users can tell, typically, right? They're backed by web components, and when, for example, the operating system gets an update, those components might not look the same as the rest of the operating system anymore. Or they might not interact the same way that native elements are, or respond to gestures the same way. But React Native does use native UI components, and so users can't actually tell the difference. But it allows you to develop at twice the speed of traditional web app or mobile apps, because you can ship to both devices with one code base. In the last app I worked on for React Native, we only had about 20 to 40 lines of platform-specific code. The rest was all shared. So that's a huge time savings. Second is a quick feedback loop. So for those of you who raise your hands for working on mobile development, not with React Native, you'll know that traditional development cycle is pretty slow. You need to wait for the app to compile anytime you want to make a change. And especially if you're plugged in, working on the real device instead of the simulator on your computer, first you need to wait for it to compile, and it takes a while. And then it needs to take the app from your computer, transfer it over the wire to your phone. In that time, you check Twitter because you don't want to wait a minute, and then half an hour later you realize what you've done. React Native has something called the packager, which basically is a server that you boot the app to your phone once, and then after that, anytime you make a change, it can just reload the app. So you can press Command-R, and it will refresh what you're seeing like that, which is awesome for those. For people who haven't done mobile development, you might take this for granted working in the browser, but this is huge for mobile development. Second is live reloading, and if you've worked on a lot of browser stuff, you might be familiar with this, but when you make a change to a file and save the file, it might automatically reload your page. So a little bit better than Command-R. And then there's hot reloading. Hot reloading is kind of like live reloading in that it will automatically refresh when you save a file, but it'll maintain your state. So if you're 5 screens into a mobile app, then you don't need to start over from the beginning again and fill out potentially multiple forms. It'll keep all that state for you, and you can just make minor changes like design tweaks without having to wait for a recompile and then go through all your screens. Next thing we really like about React Native is the mostly declarative API. So traditional mobile development I have experience with Swift. It's pretty imperative, right? I think declarative APIs are a much better API for view-related code because you just say, this is what I want it to look like, and then that's how it renders, instead of having to say, okay, render this over here, do this when this happens, etc. You just say what you want the screen to look like, and then it looks like that. Now, I say mostly because there's still a few holdouts. For example, list view, alerts, and refs. These are all things that have imperative components, which we'll see later why that causes some issues. But it is getting a little better. For example, they recently rewrote flat list view, something called flat list, which is much more declarative. And then next is unidirectional data flow. So when all the data in the application follows the same lifecycle pattern, getting it passed down from the top as props, then it leads to a much more predictable and easier to understand code base. And then finally is a similarity for web developers, right? A lot of web developers know React, at least at Thoughtbot. So not having to learn an entirely new thing like Swift, people who know React can just hop right in and pretty much get coding right away. But there's one big problem. JavaScript. JavaScript is improving as a language, and it definitely has its benefits. Most notably, its ubiquity. And you can make it better with things like Flow and TypeScript, but that still doesn't solve the statefulness problem. Enter Elm Native UI. So Elm Native UI is an awesome Elm library written by Ozzy Hanahan. He's in the back over there. So I stumbled across the library in early November, and the README had a big warning at the top. I think it still does, not for production use. But I wanted to put that to the test. I'd used Elm before, but I hadn't really found a good use case for it. I generally lean towards server-rendered HTML, at least for a lot of the types of apps I work on. But for a mobile app, if I could just replace the language entirely that I was required to use, that seemed like an interesting use case. So I started playing around with it, and it was a surprisingly great experience, given that it said at the top, not for production use. But there were still some things to work out, so I kept pushing the boundaries and adding features where necessary. And then finally in December, it had progressed to the point where it had reached feature parity with the React Native app, and the rest of the team started working on it and decided that it was a much better experience than working in React, and so we made the switch to make it the canonical version. So this is a brief rundown of how it works, or overview, I should say. So you have your Elm code. Here's your business logic and your view code. There's a small shim in the middle, which is React Native. And Elm Native UI basically talks to that. React Native renders your native components. These are real views from that native platforms. That sends events back to React Native, which sends it back through React Native UI to your Elm code. And since it's been built on React Native, it gets a lot of the benefits that I discussed before. It's cross-platform. You get that quick feedback loop, the declarative API, which also comes from Elm. And now it's similar, instead of to React developers, to our Elm developers. And on top of that, you also get access to a bunch of third-party libraries in the React ecosystem, or the React Native ecosystem, if you write a small shim on top of it. And working with React Native, or Elm Native UI, is pretty much the same as working with Elm HTML. As you can see, the functions are pretty much the same. You get your list of properties or attributes, and a list of the children nodes, and you just return node message or HTML message. So it's pretty much the same thing. If you know Elm HTML, you can hop right into Elm Native UI. And after working with it a bit, I really started to see it working with Elm as TDD on steroids in a sense. It's not a complete replacement for tests, but the feeling of doing TDD is very similar to working in Elm. When you're working with React or React Native, if you miss a step, there's not much guidance to figure out what you missed and what code you need to add to get it to work again. And we kind of came across this. So if you're used to TDD, where you write a test and then you get an error message which tells you what code you need to write to fix the test. So I liken it to TDD on steroids because now you don't even have to write the test. You just write a little bit of code, and then the compiler guides you the rest of the way through the app, or through the feature. So if you've done React Native, you may be familiar with this. It's the red screen of death. This is what you see when you get a runtime error, which is always. So working on Purple Train, we got 0 runtime errors, which is amazing. Yeah. I don't think this safety can be understated. It's huge. So with all the benefits from React Native and Elm combined, we get an environment that's cross-platform. You get a quick feedback loop, a declarative API. It's similar to web developers, in this case, Elm developers. Has few to no bugs, thanks to the Elm compiler. It's easy to refactor, and it's fun to write. So with all the great things, there's still some downsides. The library itself is incomplete. It's missing a lot of things that React Native has, so people who are interested in it would have to actually write those things. It's also missing library support. There are 0 Elm Native UI libraries. And it's also not in the Elm package index, so if you actually want to do it, there's a bit of loops you have to jump through to actually manually download the packages to get it to work. And then, of course, there's the additional layers of abstraction, right? You're building on top of React Native. And there's that imperative mismatch, which I discussed before. So what's next? I think because of some of those downsides, it's probably not realistic to have React Native as a platform for the long term. What would be better is if we could get a little closer to the metal and have an actual ecosystem that's built for Elm instead of having to use React Native as a shim and work around these imperative APIs that React Native provides, which is possible. So Facebook has open sourced and extracted parts of the view layer, such as Yoga, which is available now. And then they also recently, I think this past week, pulled out the packager, which I discussed before. So now, basically, we can reuse that server that works in the background to make it seamlessly deploy or compile and refresh in your app. And so Google Summer of Code also has someone, I think, working and mentored by Evan, and they're checking out Yoga. Cool. So they're doing research on that, and we'll see what comes of that. So a lot of people have asked, should I use this? And the answer is probably not. If you have a toy app, or you're okay with taking big risks on something that is probably not very long lived, it's a lot of fun, and I definitely recommend playing with it if you have a toy or something that your business doesn't actually depend on. But it's not quite ready if your business depends on it. So the app is open source. It's on GitHub here. That's it. I'm Josh. Here's my info. Let's have some questions.
Any question?
Oh, and Ozzy has stickers for Elm Native UI, if anyone is interested. He's in the back.
Questions?
Okay.
What's up, man? Thanks for doing this. Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like? What's the story like when you want to implement something from the native API that is not ready for you to consume with the library as is?
So, yeah, so basically, for anything that wasn't implemented yet, we'd have to add into the Elm Native UI library, which involved writing native code, which is not to be confused with Elm Native UI, right? Like, so writing actual JavaScript.
You're talking Java. And what about components that are not implemented even by React Native? Can you go down to native, Swift, implement it in Android, and then abstract it all up so you can consume it in Elm?
I would probably stay away from that if I could. So with React Native, you can do that. I didn't have to do that, and I'm not sure how exactly that would integrate with Elm code. I haven't done it in React Native either, so I can't speak to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone else? I think
Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, for you, when would be the time when you would say, okay, you can use it in your production projects?
Never, for now.
Okay.
Well, for toys, for things
Never
that...
for no.
Yeah, I wouldn't use it for something like fruits.com.
You did it, you mentioned fruits.
But the experience was awesome, and I hope that the research goes successfully and someone steps up to work on writing on an actual Elm ecosystem for mobile devices that isn't built on top of React Native.
Okay, so for everybody here who is really interested in your open source project or even other open source projects, how would you recommend to contribute?
To Elm Native UI?
Yeah.
I think it's you should contribute if you want to work on this in the short term, but expect that it may or may not go away at some point and be replaced by a something that's closer to the metal.
Yeah, like I'm not asking if we should contribute, but how.
Oh, how? Open an issue or a pull request.
Okay.
Or are you talking specifically about what might come after the React Native wrapper?
Yeah.
You'd have to speak to Evan about that.
Not always just like if we have more people, would it be faster?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but like, no, I know that adding stuff won't do anything faster.
Yeah, so what's the question?
I know that it's not okay.
It's probably a little early for that,
Okay.
but at some point.
Okay. So shall we stop that?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's meet in 10 minutes, and then for the last talk. And please stay until the end so we can do a group photo of everybody.
Thank you.